Welcome to episode 203 of Meet the Thriller Author, the podcast where we dive into the dark and suspenseful world of thriller books, exploring the minds behind some of the most gripping tales on the shelves today. I'm your host, Alan Peterson, and today I'm thrilled to welcome to the podcast Ace Atkins. Ace is a New York Times bestselling author, a former crime beat reporter from Florida, and an absolute master of the thriller genre. His latest novel, Don't Let the Devil Ride, published on June 25th, marks his 30th publication. His previous novels include 11 books in the Quinn Colson series and multiple true crime novels based on infamous crooks and killers. In 2010, he was chosen by Robert B. Parker's family to continue the iconic Spencer series, adding 10 novels to the franchise. He lives in Oxford, Mississippi with his family. Before we jump into our conversation with Ace, I'd like to remind everyone to please rate and subscribe to Meet the Thriller Author on your favorite podcast platform. This helps us grow and bring you more engaging content. Also, don't forget to visit thrillingreads.com/links to connect with me and join the Thrilling Reads newsletter for the latest updates and exclusive content. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Ace Atkins to the show. Hey, everybody, this is Alan with Meet the Thriller Author. And on the podcast today, I have Ace Atkins. Welcome, Ace.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Great to be here.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on to the show, to the podcast, and doing this interview. I appreciate it. Looking at your background here, and you started out as a crime beat reporter. Did you was the master plan to become a fiction writer, or did you just kind of develop as you were working as a reporter?
I think it was certainly part of the master plan. I knew ultimately I wanted to be a crime novelist. I knew the kind of books that I wanted to write, but I was lacking two things, which were some really good writing skills and working with some really good editors, and at the same time having some real world experience. And I was very fortunate to kind of get into the last days of the old journalism business, and I was in there in the late 1990s. We were still producing newspapers. There was the website was kind of an offshoot. But yeah, absolutely, it was a way of getting experience, working with some great editors, other writers, to the point where I felt like I could make that jump.
Yeah, things sure have changed in journalism now. Even reading an article is now like half the article is tweet embeds,
or written by AI. I guess it's it's a strange time. It's not good for our country for sure. We just particularly with local journalism and knowing what's happening in your community and really just even having reporters as a watchdog in your local government to make sure you're not being the graft isn't massive. But I think we're really entering probably a golden age of graft in this country as far as politicians working, without any type of oversight.
Yeah, you're starting to see in the news when they do get caught. It's been going on for like 10, 15 years or something. It's so cool too. In your books, most of your books are set in the South, and I know you live in the South. You live in Mississippi. Is that the region that inspired you? Do you always want to set them there when you started to write these books?
Yeah, definitely. I'm originally from the South. I'm from Alabama. I've lived a lot of different places. I've worked in Florida as a journalist, and growing up, I lived in other cities. But my family is deeply Southern, and I've got very deep Southern roots in Alabama and also in Mississippi. And so I've been back at Mississippi for almost, God knows, 25 years now. And it is the place that I have written about other places, but it is the place that probably draws me most. And I think it's the complexity of the South. It's what I always talk about, the good, the bad, the ugly about Southerners. And it's all those kind of conflicting emotions that I think drives those stories. The last 11 books I did with a character named Quinn Colson, which was a series was set in North Mississippi. And then, of course, the new book, Don't Let the Devil Ride, while I think slightly less Southern, is set in Memphis.
Yeah, and that's something I noticed too, because you're pretty close to the Tennessee border, right, where you're at?
Yeah, I mean, it's in fact the joke is when you live North Mississippi is that Memphis is the unofficial capital. So I can be in less than an hour, and that's not only a place that I love to enjoy to hang out and have a lot of friends up there, but it's also a place where you go to Target, Costco, things like that. So it's really our big city, not too far away.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's it's been great for your research. We'll get into that when we start talking about the Don't Let the Devil Ride, but that's easier to make the jaunt over for your research, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. It was great because I didn't have to do any research. We live in a place, almost 25 years, you can just sit down and write, and that's a good situation to be in.
I wanted to ask you too because I thought it was so fascinating. I remember a few years ago I read your books when you picked up the Spencer for Hire books, from Robert B. Parker's estate. I mean, that was so cool. Obviously, I think most fans of this genre love his books. I mean, were you a fan, and how daunting was that? And what was the process like? Did you have to like audition, or how did that work?
Yeah, that was late 2010. And yeah, I was a huge and continue to be a huge Robert B. Parker fan. I was, I grew up on those books. I was inspired by those books. I thought Parker was just a wonderful writer. I liked the tone. I liked the setting in Boston. I just liked everything about Spencer. So I was asked to contribute back in 2010. It was kind of known that the Parker family wanted to continue on his series. And first up, of course, would be Spencer. And when it was first mentioned to me, I thought it was going to be Jesse Stone because it was so deeply personal to Bob, because Bob essentially was Spencer. But they let me know pretty quickly it was for Spencer. And, again, I didn't have to do a lot of research. I've been reading those books forever. And I sat down and I started what I thought would be Bob's next Spencer book. And I continued on, somewhat in the field that he'd been doing for the last books, but really trying to kind of reinvigorate more those early Spencer novels and kind of have a little bit more edge to them as they were in the very beginning. And I wrote 50 pages and I sent them to Bob's longtime editor, a wonderful woman named Christine Pepe, and got on with what I was working on. I was working on my own series. I was working on my own books and didn't think that much about it. And then at the end of the, around Christmas, I think I got a call from the people at Putnam that I was unanimously selected by not only the editor, but Bob's longtime agent and his family. And the only thing they couldn't figure out is they never met me as a writer from Boston. And so they had to break the news that I actually wasn't from Boston, that I actually lived in Mississippi. And thankfully that wasn't a deal breaker. And they, the Parker family, including Joan Parker, Bob's wife, was incredibly welcoming and wonderful to me. His best friend was a man named Mel Farman, and Mel became my research partner for a great number of years writing those books. So I wrote 10 of them, and then it was time for me to move on, but it was a terrific experience.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. Yeah, that's tip of the hat to you too, because that's something when those books first came out, and I read a couple of them, and then later on when I found out about your background, I'm like, oh man, I just assumed you're from Boston, from that area. So you did a great job.
I'm a good researcher, and I'm a good journalist, and so I took it very seriously. At a lot of places in Boston now that I haven't been. And got to meet a lot of friends and people that were in the really welcoming, and I took it very seriously. I took the job very seriously and had a great time.
Yeah, I can imagine. That would be such an honor. And so I want to ask you now well, first of all, congratulations on Don't Let the Devil Ride. That comes out on June 25th, and it's on pre-order now. But this will come out when it's out. So just congratulations on that. So can you tell us a little bit? First of all, I want to ask you, that title is so cool. What's the story behind that title? And can you tell us a little bit about the significance about that?
Well, it was funny, as happens with a lot of books, is you write a book under a completely different title. And then by the time you're finished with it and it goes to the marketing people and sales folks, you get notes and it goes back and forth. And we went through, I'm not kidding, hundreds of titles for this particular book. And, some of them were great and some of them were awful. There's a line in the book, I don't think I'm giving anything away, but there's a really horrendous event that happens. And one of the characters, not the only character, it's an ensemble piece, is a guy named Porter Hayes, who's a legendary private detective in Memphis. He started his company back in 1971. He's been around, and he's having a conversation with his colleague at this investigation firm after this very grisly discovery. And the colleague mentions the old gospel song, "Don't Let the Devil Ride." And what you learn from that is, if you let the devil ride, let him in your car, he's going to want to drive the car. And that's the nature of the lyrics. And that moment, it just seemed perfect for the tone of the book and the feel of the book. And especially since it's a decent amount of it happens in the Black community in Memphis to have a connection to the gospel song. I thought it was very fitting, and thankfully the people in marketing and sales they agreed with me.
Yeah, and it's a great cover too. I absolutely love the cover, the colors, and
I said, and we went through quite a few of those as well. It's interesting when you write a book, and when you're lucky enough to work with a really great publisher. There's so many details that so many other people involved in the process, and from graphic designers to copy editors to your own editor to marketing and the great folks in publicity who put people like you and me in touch. It's a whole system that puts things out, and so it's cool to see it finally come together.
I think that's something so great about your writing too. Is it seems like you really put a lot of emphasis and effort on the characters. From reading it, you can tell that it's a big part of the storyline. So here we have Addison McKellar, and you mentioned Porter Hayes. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What's the origin of those characters and kind of your process?
Yeah, Porter Hayes is a character I've been wanting to write for a long time. He's a guy that I've been wanting to write about for forever. And actually, I was working on a completely different novel that I've been kind of picking at for different, for years. That he was a lead in the story, and then I started working on this book about this woman named Addison McKellar, who is completely thrown into complete upheaval with her life when her husband disappears while on a business trip to London, and she can't reach him. And then she goes down to his office, and she finds out that the office is not even the office, where he worked. It's a completely different company, and all the people that she thought that knew him or kind of shady about where he's been, and she ends up working with this private eye. So I had him in mind for quite some time, and I knew that this was a perfect vehicle for him to be in. And then Addison kind of came about really from there was a certain kind of woman of means in Memphis that had member of the country club, kids into private schools, maybe a little private personal business on the side that was more of a vanity project, and yoga and Pilates, and seemingly her life was going very well, and seemingly she had a great situation going. And it was interesting to kind of reverse that, and not only put somebody like that in the situation, but hopefully look at this novel and see that Addison's a little bit more than she appears to be when we first meet her. I think when I first was writing the book, she was a little bit one-dimensional as far as her likes or involvements, but as you peel back those layers and you read the novel, you find out she's a lot different than she appears on the surface.
And what is your process now too? When you get the idea, like you said, you've been thinking about it for a while. From the time you start looking at getting the idea and start writing the book, can you tell us a little bit about that process? And are you do you outline, or do you kind of just figure it out as you go along? Or
I do kind of all the above. I do anything that works, and everything for me tends to be. I'm very jealous of those writers who are have their program that they're working all the time, that they know exactly what their schedule is going to be and how things are going to go, and how they do the outlining, and how they get everything set up. And for me, it just, some days that works for me and some days it doesn't. So I kind of do outline, but I also can, I guess for lack of a better term, call an audible, where I just feel like that's not going to work, and I may completely reverse what I think that I'm going to be doing at that point. For me, I think even in the crime thriller world, where people think it's very event driven or a lot of danger and intrigue and that kind of stuff, for me, that is very to the characters. So I spend a lot more time thinking about those characters like Addison and Porter. And there's a woman who's an actress, a former actress named Joanna Grayson, who's part of the story. And years ago, she had worked with Elvis in a movie in the late 60s. And now she kind of goes through her her whole existence is going to these book signings and fan gatherings of Elvis people down on Elvis Presley Boulevard. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about those people before I write anything. And then they, as strange as it sounds or whatever, they kind of tell me what's going to happen in the story. But they're not, to me, they're not chess pieces. They're not just people that are around in the action. They really, I think, hopefully, at the very best, form what the story is going to be.
Yeah, and even though these are entertaining crime fiction books and everything, but you're kind of known for your books. You tackle complex social issues. Are there any particular issues in this one? I know there is, but can you tell us a little bit about that? About this one? What about that?
Well, I think some of my other books probably have been, specifically the books I wrote, the Colson series, set in North Mississippi, really dealt a lot with pretty politics and hypocrisy and racism and things that are just so embedded in the Deep South. You really can't do anything without writing about those things. I think that I touch upon those things and don't let the devil ride, but I don't think that those are necessarily forefront. But I mean, you can't write about Memphis without talking about social justice, and you can't talk about the deep history with civil rights. And so those things are touched upon in the novel, but not necessarily the driving narrative that has been in some of the earlier books.
I just wanted to ask you too, because you've written on like the Quinn Colson books and the Spencer books. You've written a lot of series, and this is a standalone, correct? This book is a standalone?
Yes.
So
yeah, and it's the first time that I not my first standalone, but the first time in about a dozen years that I'm writing a book that's simply just the novel. I think that there could be some spin-offs of this kind of story, and time will tell how that'll happen. But for me, it was kind of freeing. As when you're writing Spencer, you kind of know Spencer. Spencer's not going to die in the end. The story's going to continue, and you've got to know what's going to happen. A little bit know what's going to happen. But for this was fun to create something kind of all new and different, and to do something that I haven't done for quite some time.
And so now on the writing process too, because I have aspiring writers that listen to this podcast as well. So love to pick your brain on this type of stuff. So you talked a little bit about the outlining and your process here, but so just kind of curious about your routine. Do you have set hours? Do you have word count goals?
I think I wouldn't be truthful if I told you that I was rigorous about those things. I would say when I'm working really well, when things are moving ahead and I am deep in production of a book, yes, I tend to get to my office where I am. I tend to get here early. I take a break for lunch. I come back in and write for the second half of the day. But that much being said, there's also days where, for whatever reason, you get jammed up, and they may be things that have nothing to do with writing. And those are things you have to, you kind of have to sidestep or deal with very quickly, and it can really slow you. But I would say, just for instance, I prefer to leave my office at 5:30. That's ideal, so I can get home and spend time with my family and have a normal life. But if it's a day where I'm deep in production and I have to finish a scene, or I have to finish something happening in the book, I'll stay here till 10 o'clock at night to get that done, because it's very easy. It's very easy, especially as a writer, when you're working for yourself, is to say, I'll do it later. I'll worry about that tomorrow. But when you've been doing this as long as I have, what you realize is those days will stack up, and you really have to commit to your work days of getting done what you have promised to get done those days. And it's hard, it's things, you kind of life happens. I mean, there's things that can happen. I had some computer problems last week. I had to take my computer in. I've got to go find a backup computer, and all those things are very inconvenient, but you just, like every other kind of job, you just have to deal with them.
Yeah, you're usually tackling more than one project at a time, right? Because you usually publish a couple books a year, right? Is that usually your pace?
Yeah, for the last 10 years, or not for the last 2 years, but previous to that, I was doing 2 books a year. And that included, writing 2 books a year, but also promoting 2 books a year. And it was almost really separating yourself, because one I was doing for the Parker estate, and no matter what I was doing with that, even though I wrote the novel, I was still, doing, work for hire. I was doing work for hire for the Parker family, but someone still had to go out and promote the book and talk about it, that kind of thing. But those projects never overlapped. I mean, when I wrote a Spencer book, my head was firmly placed in Boston. I was firmly into that voice, because when I was working on the book, I'm not writing as me. I'm not writing a story as I would tell the story. I'm writing the story. And this was not something that was imposed upon me. It's just something that I felt very strongly about doing when I was writing Spencer, is I wanted to write the book as Robert Parker would have written that book. And I wanted the book to sound like Robert B. Parker. I didn't want it to sound like Ace Atkins. So that's another layer of complexity if you're writing and making decisions, because I might have done things differently, but I was writing them as Bob would. But yeah, never would do those projects overlap, point being copy editing with one book and beginning another. But I could never write prose at the same time.
As far as your influences, you mentioned, of course, Parker. Were you a fan of the genre? Like growing up, are you reading crime fiction? And who are some of the other
Oh yeah,
authors that influenced you?
yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you'll hear writers who will say, "Wow, that's a good place to be in writing thrillers or mysteries or crime books because they sell so much." You tend, and so I get really irked when I hear about writers who kind of get into the genre. I would say dishonestly, they get into it because they want to make some money. They feel like that anybody can do this. They feel like it's something it's just an easy sell. And you can spot those people. You can spot those people in the writing that they don't really love it. They're doing it, for financial reasons, which is something I would tell your listeners certainly is never get into becoming a writer for financial reasons. That's not the best profession. You do it because you love it. You love it and you're drawn to it. And behind my shoulder over here, these are every book that John D. McDonald published, and certainly Robert B. Parker, and Elmore Leonard, and going back to Hammett and Chandler, and Ross McDonald, and all that stuff. James Lee Burke. I loved it, and so there was never really a question of the kind of book I was going to write. It's more about how I would take what I learned from those masters and how I could make it my own.
And were you able to sell your first manuscript that you put out there, or
No.
No? Yeah, it seems like that with everybody.
No, I would call, and I really say this, like, what was my first manuscript? I'd say first manuscript is like the first thing I thought was a book. And I don't necessarily know what I'd call it, but I thought it was a book, and it was of the right thickness. It had a title on it. I don't know really what to call it, but I sent that. This was back in the '90s. I mean, this is really before editors were doing a lot of email stuff. I mean, this was still very old-fashioned business, and you used to have to go and print the damn man. I mean, it was I think now anyone who wants to write a book, you can zap it to an editor or whatever and send it to them, and it's no financial outlay. But when I used to send manuscripts out, it cost about $40 a time because I had to go to Kinko's and get the damn thing printed out. But it was there were a few people who liked it. I was able to get an agent. Had a couple of interesting responses and letters back from it. And one of those editors that liked the book but decided not to buy it said, "Send me your next one." And I sent him the next one, and he was the only editor I sent the book to, and they bought it right away. It was at St. Martin's Press back in I was like 26 years old. They bought it, and I thought that's it. This is great. This is it was just it was a very. I was still working as a newspaper reporter, very thrilled. But yeah, on the first manuscript that I was sending out over a year's period of time, I collected dozens of rejections, and and I kept them all. I read, I don't know who it was, but I read about a writer one time that had a very small studio apartment, and I actually put them up above my desk to kind of spur me on. And the best thing I did was I just didn't sit on that manuscript, but I learned from my mistakes from that manuscript and learned how to do things better. And then that, of course, the next book was the first thing I published.
Yeah, I forgot to ask you this earlier. Any books that you've written that were kind of based on some of the crime stuff that you're reporting on as a reporter? Did any of that any of that make it into one of your novels?
It's really a weird thing, and I can't really quite answer this, effectively. I'm not really sure why, but I was surrounded by, in the '90s and early 2000s, I was surrounded by real life crime all the time as a reporter. I went to crime scenes and covered murders and kidnappings and bank robberies, and I mean, crime was, Florida is a weird place. I mean, when you're in Central Florida, there's all kinds of weird, bizarre stories that are happening. And it was but I didn't in any way ever contemplate writing a Florida book. And I think there was just such a prevalence of Florida crime writers at that time. They were just all over the place. And I just did not think I had anything new to bring to the table. I think I did. I think in retrospect, if I were talking to my younger self, I'd say just write about the things that you see every day. But I think part of it was kind of a form of escapism for me to return back to, my native deep South and to write about the world that, I had kind of left. It was kind of a mental break. But then years later, when I was living in Mississippi and I was still writing about Mississippi, I ended up deciding to write a book about Tampa and crime and reporters and that kind of thing. But it was a period piece. It was set in the 1950s. And it involves old cops and detectives and people that I knew as older men and I wrote about them as younger men, in covering that beat of Tampa in the 1950s. So, it's interesting, but yeah, I don't necessarily can't say a few things. I wrote a Quinn Colson book that was the last one that was published, called The Heathens, and it was about a young woman who's 17, and she and her boyfriend are accused of murdering her mother and go on the run from the law. And that was a story that I had covered. But of course, I changed everything to Mississippi and changed a lot of details, but it certainly was a bit of inspiration.
Yes, I saw a series of books that you wrote that were set like in the 30s and the 50s. Do you prefer to write contemporary? Do you enjoy writing those historical type thriller, crime fiction books?
I really enjoy writing those historical books, and I really get into the research. I wrote a book that, for instance, the last historical book that I wrote, or whatever you would call it, I think that was part of the issue of reaching an audience with those books. You don't really know what to call it, because I think most people, when you talk about historicals, you think about people in women in petticoats and men coats and that kind of thing. So, and I was writing about the 1930s and kind of a near history, or at least what I think is a near history. And I was writing about gangsters, and I wrote a book about Machine Gun Kelly, who originally was from Memphis, and his run from the law. And it was a really dark comedy. I really felt it was almost like in the spirit of like the Coen brothers or something like that. But it was very difficult to reach a mass audience with those people, with the readers. I don't know, some people just don't. I think it's a hard thing to market. It really is. So I found I could reach a larger audience with more contemporary stories, for whatever reason that is. For what I enjoy writing, yeah, I love writing historicals, and if I had the chance, I would jump right into it. I'm particularly interested in anything in the 20th century.
And what about what are you working on now? Are you still continuing with the Quinn Colson books? What's your next project?
Well, I'm working on a second standalone, or whatever you want to call it, novel at the moment, that'll be out next year from Morrow, and it's very different from Don't Let the Devil Ride, which is a contemporary crime book. This is a spy novel. We're talking about the writers that really inspired me and how I got into it, but I didn't mention, I was mentioning all the crime writers I like, but I didn't mention really the gateway drug for me into becoming obsessed with books were spy novels, and how much I loved Ian Fleming and John le Carré, and that really, I think, got really to love books. And so I'm writing somewhat of a tribute to that world. And then after that, maybe back to Quinn Colson. I kind of left the last one on a cliffhanger, and I'd like to see how things turned out.
All right. Well, that is fantastic, Ace. I want to really thank you. One last question. I always
Sure.
ask my guests advice for aspiring writers that are listening to this.
Something that I hear often, and this might seem very strange, but I'll hear from people who would like to be a writer, and they want to have a book, and they want their picture on the book or whatever, for I don't know why, but they're into it, but they don't love books. And it just seems really odd to me. It just seems like the weirdest kind of thing. And the very first thing, if you want to be a writer, is you have to be not just like reading, you have to be obsessed with it. You've got to, this is just a fraction of my book collection here. I've been collecting books since I was 13 years old. And I love books. I love spending time in bookstores. I would be doing this, I wouldn't tell my publisher this, but I would tell you I do this for free. I love it. I'm into so really reading as much as you can. And then once you make the decision that you want to become a writer, it's to write all the time. And don't be afraid of criticism. Don't solicit advice from people that you don't respect and you don't give your manuscript to somebody who's, not qualified to read it, but also take criticism from people who are in the know. If you're part of a writer's workshop, or if you're an MF program, something like that is really important. So reading and writing nonstop, and just having the commitment and drive to do it, and to really love it. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, that's good advice. And so best place for listeners to find you to be at your website, aceatkins.com. Is that the best place?
Well, I'm like every damn writer you talk to. Got Facebook and Instagram, and draw the line at TikTok. I'm too old for that crap. But I'm on Twitter. Find me in all those places. But I do converse with fans, and I do happy to. In fact, tonight I live here in Oxford, Mississippi, and across the way I'm talking to interviewing a writer, doing what you did right now, to talk to a writer named Henry Wise. And I've known Henry for a number of years since he was an MFA student, and he wanted to publish a book. And his drive and determination and working, I think he probably wrote 3 or 4 books until he had this one published. And this is his debut book coming out tonight at Square Books here in Oxford. So I love seeing that when that happens. And also I love seeing that what happens with people who are committed to doing it. So that's the fun for me. But yeah, you can find me on all those social platforms.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I saw on your website you're doing a book tour. You're going to bookstores across the country.
I will be everywhere. I mean, I'm going a handful of locations, but everywhere from Memphis to Wichita to to Phoenix. And so I'll be on a quick little whirlwind tour, and that's always fun for me as well.
All right, Ace. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Enjoyed talking to you. And Don't Let the Devil Ride will be out on June 25th.
Thanks so much, Alan. Pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Meet the Thriller Author. I hope you found our conversation with today's guest as enlightening and engaging as I did. Before we part ways, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and review it on your podcast platform. Your feedback not only supports our show, but also helps other thriller enthusiasts find us. Don't forget to visit thrillingreads.com/links to sign up for our Thrilling Reads newsletter. It's a great way to stay updated on all the latest episodes and exclusive content designed just for our listeners. And if you're curious about my own thrillers, head over to alanpeterson.com. You'll find all my books there, along with some behind-the-scenes insights into my writing process. I'll catch you on the next episode of Meet the Thriller Author, where we'll continue to explore the intriguing dark alleys of the thriller and mystery genre together. Until then, keep the pages turning.